November 3rd, 1962, the weight of greatness. Los Angeles had a strange way of making even the most powerful men feel small. The city shimmered with possibility by day, but at night it exposed the quiet anxieties hiding behind success. On the evening of November 3rd, 1962, two of the most recognized faces in the world sat across from each other in a dimly lit corner booth of a discreet restaurant tucked just far enough off Sunset Boulevard to escape flashbulbs. One was Marlon Brando, already revered as one of the most serious actors of his generation. The other was Elvis Presley, the global music phenomenon whose name alone could cause traffic to stop and radio stations to tremble. To the outside world, both men had everything: fame, wealth, influence. They were icons in an era that was just beginning to understand what true celebrity meant. Yet that night, neither of them looked like icons. They looked like two men carrying invisible weight. Brando had always studied people with a kind of quiet intensity, as if he were trying to see beyond their public version. Elvis noticed that look as soon as they sat down. It wasn't judgment. It wasn't admiration. It was assessment. Brando had a habit of examining the soul before speaking to it. They had met years earlier through mutual industry friends. Their friendship was not loud or constant. It wasn't built on parties or publicity. It was built on shared understanding. They both knew what it meant to be turned into a symbol. They both understood the loneliness that comes when millions adore an image that barely resembles the private man behind it. Dinner had begun casually. They spoke about film schedules, about music sessions, about the exhaustion of travel. Elvis smiled easily, but there was fatigue behind his eyes. His laugh came quickly, yet it lingered a second too long, as if trying to convince the room that everything was fine. Brando finally leaned back, folded his hands, and spoke with unusual directness. "You're wasting your talent." The words were not cruel, they were not loud, but they were heavy. Elvis did not respond immediately. His expression did not change. He simply looked down at the tablecloth for a brief moment, as though he had expected those words long before they were spoken. By 1962, Elvis Presley was not struggling financially. His films were profitable. His records sold. Studios were satisfied. His manager had built a system that guaranteed visibility and revenue. But artistry and profitability are not the same thing, and deep down Elvis knew it. Brando continued carefully, choosing each word with intention. "You have presence that can't be taught. You have something raw, something real, but these movies, they don't show it." Elvis inhaled slowly. He had heard criticism before, but rarely from someone who genuinely respected craft. This was different. Brando wasn't attacking his popularity. He was mourning his unused depth. "You think I don't know that?" Elvis finally replied, his voice softer than expected. There was no anger in it, only honesty. For years, Elvis had operated inside a carefully structured machine. After returning from military service, the strategy had been clear: safe films, controlled image, consistent output. The formula worked commercially, but repetition can dull even the brightest spark. Musical sequences filmed on beaches, light romantic plots, predictable scripts. They paid well, they protected his brand, they required little risk. Risk, however, is where artists grow. Brando understood risk. He had built his reputation on emotional vulnerability. He chose roles that exposed fragility, conflict, and moral ambiguity. He believed performance was not about appearance, but about truth. "Elvis," Brando said quietly, "you could do serious work. You could shock people. You could make them forget the image and see the man." Elvis's jaw tightened slightly. "You get to choose," he replied. "That's the difference." There it was, not bitterness, just reality. Brando had fought for roles. He had resisted studio expectations. He had the leverage to say no. Elvis, despite his fame, felt confined by contracts and expectations built when he was younger and less aware of how Hollywood functioned. His career was not entirely in his own hands. But that wasn't the deepest issue. The deeper issue was exhaustion. "I'm tired, Marlon," Elvis admitted after a long silence. "I'm tired of fighting every direction at once." The restaurant seemed to shrink around them. The noise of cutlery and distant conversation faded into background hum. For the first time that evening, Elvis looked less like a superstar and more like a young man overwhelmed by the machine he had helped create. He spoke of pressure without dramatics, of expectations without complaint, of the loneliness that followed him even in crowded rooms. His mother's passing years earlier had left a wound that fame could not soothe. He carried grief quietly, but it shaped him more than audiences ever realized. "I know there's more in me," he said. "I just don't know how to reach it without tearing everything else apart." Brando listened without interruption. This was no longer about film quality. It was about identity, about whether a person could remain whole while being packaged and sold to the world. "You're not a product," Brando said firmly. "You're an artist." Elvis almost laughed at that, not because he disagreed, but because the word felt distant from how he had been functioning. Artist. The title carried responsibility. It required intention. It required courage. "What if I try something serious?" Elvis asked quietly, "and fail?" The question was not rhetorical. It was vulnerable. For someone who had known public adoration from such a young age, failure carried a particular fear. If the world loved the myth, would it still accept the man? Brando leaned forward. "Failure is honest," he said. "Playing it safe forever is." The sentence lingered. There are moments in life when truth arrives not as an attack but as an invitation. That night, Brando's words were not condemnation. They were an invitation to reclaim authorship over one's own path. Elvis sat silently for a long time after that. He wasn't defensive, he wasn't wounded, he was thinking. Thinking about the early days when music felt dangerous and alive. Thinking about performing without choreography, without polished scripts. Thinking about the electricity of authenticity. He realized something subtle but powerful. He missed risk. By the time dinner ended, nothing externally had changed. Contracts remained. Studio expectations remained. Public perception remained. But internally, a shift had begun. Elvis walked out of the restaurant that night carrying something different than when he arrived. Not shame, not regret. Possibility. Sometimes it takes a friend brave enough to speak an uncomfortable truth to awaken something dormant. Brando had not offered a solution. He had offered a mirror. As they parted ways under the cool California night sky, Brando placed a hand on Elvis's shoulder. "Don't let yourself disappear inside the machine," he said. Elvis nodded. He didn't promise transformation. He didn't make grand declarations. But inside, something had stirred, not rebellion, not anger, but awareness. And awareness, once awakened, rarely returns to sleep. That November evening did not produce immediate change. The world would not see visible results for years, but seeds rarely bloom the same day they are planted. In the quiet space between expectation and courage, Elvis Presley began to reconsider who he was and who he might still become. The quiet war within. In the weeks after that November dinner, nothing outwardly dramatic occurred in the life of Elvis Presley. The headlines did not change. The studio schedules continued uninterrupted. Meetings were held, scripts were delivered, rehearsals were arranged. To anyone watching from the outside, the machine moved forward with the same dependable rhythm it always had. Yet internally, something had shifted in a way that was impossible to reverse. The words spoken by Marlon Brando did not echo as criticism. They echoed as a question Elvis could no longer ignore. Who are you becoming? Elvis had spent years living at a pace that allowed little time for reflection. Success, especially on the scale he experienced, rarely encourages stillness. There was always another appearance, another film, another obligation. The structure surrounding him was efficient and profitable, and in many ways protective. It kept chaos at bay. But structure can slowly become confinement when it leaves no space for growth. Brando's challenge had forced Elvis to examine not just the quality of his films, but the trajectory of his identity. Was he expanding as an artist, or repeating himself safely? At night, when Graceland fell quiet and the laughter of friends faded into distant murmurs, Elvis found himself replaying that conversation. He did not resent Brando for speaking bluntly. In fact, he found himself grateful. Most people in his orbit were careful. They were polite. They avoided uncomfortable truths because his success provided stability for them as well. It was easier to celebrate chart positions than to question creative depth. Brando had done something rare. He had separated admiration from honesty. He had believed Elvis capable of more, and that belief lingered like a light in a dark hallway. The deeper struggle was not about contracts alone. It was about fear. Elvis had risen so quickly and so young that he had never truly experienced artistic obscurity. His early performances had been explosive, electric, almost defiant. But as the years progressed, predictability replaced risk. Predictability felt safe. It guaranteed income. It preserved the brand, yet safety has a quiet cost. It erodes urgency. It softens edges. It can make an artist forget the sensation of standing on uncertain ground. During filming sessions in the months that followed, Elvis began noticing small details he had once ignored. He felt the routine in the scripts. He sensed when scenes required little emotional investment. He completed his work professionally, but internally he was asking himself whether he was capable of more complexity than he was being asked to deliver. This internal questioning did not make him reckless. It made him observant. The transformation Brando had initiated was not rebellion. It was awareness. There were moments when Elvis considered confronting the system more directly. He knew that pushing back would create tension. It might disrupt carefully negotiated relationships. It could even lead to financial risk. The people around him had built a successful formula, and formulas are not easily abandoned when they are profitable. Yet the internal pressure to evolve was growing stronger. It was not driven by ego. It was driven by dignity. Elvis did not want to look back one day and realize that he had settled for being comfortable instead of being courageous. At the same time, loneliness continued to shadow him. Fame had not cured isolation. It had complicated it. Public adoration does not automatically translate into personal understanding. Elvis was surrounded by people, but true vulnerability remained rare. The night with Brando had been unusual because it had allowed him to speak without performance. That kind of honesty was uncommon in an environment built on image. He began to realize that his artistic stagnation and his emotional isolation were connected. When a person feels unseen personally, it becomes harder to reveal oneself creatively. Meanwhile, Brando carried the conversation in his own way. In private discussions within the industry, he found himself defending Elvis's potential. When others dismissed Presley as a commercial figurehead, Brando quietly disagreed. He had witnessed the depth beneath the surface. He believed that the public version of Elvis did not fully represent the private intelligence and emotional awareness he had encountered. Brando did not publicly campaign for him. That would have been inappropriate. Instead, he held on to a conviction that true artists eventually find their way back to themselves. As the mid-1960s approached, cultural currents were beginning to shift. Music was evolving, audiences were changing, new voices were emerging. Elvis observed this transformation carefully. He did not panic, he did not lash out, but he understood that remaining static in a changing world was not sustainable. The hunger that had once fueled his early career began to reawaken. He remembered the feeling of stepping onto a stage with nothing but a microphone and a song that carried genuine emotion. That memory was not nostalgic, it was motivating. The internal war was subtle. One side argued for stability and continuity. The other urged reinvention and authenticity. Reinvention, however, required courage not only professionally but personally. To step into more serious artistic territory meant risking comparison, criticism, and perhaps even rejection. Elvis had to confront an uncomfortable possibility, that his fear of failure had been quietly shaping his choices more than he realized. There were evenings when he would sit alone, guitar resting lightly against his knee, and play songs that were never intended for film soundtracks. In those private moments, he felt closer to the version of himself that Brando had spoken about. The rawness returned in fragments. The intensity flickered. He recognized that the depth was still there. It had simply been dormant under layers of expectation. Change did not come in a dramatic declaration. It came in small decisions. Elvis began asking different questions during meetings. He became more attentive to material. He expressed interest in projects that allowed greater authenticity. These were not acts of defiance. They were steps toward alignment. The machine did not collapse overnight, but its grip began to loosen as his self-awareness strengthened. What Brando had offered that night was not a plan. It was permission. Permission to believe that commercial success did not have to define artistic limits. Permission to pursue seriousness without abandoning popularity. Permission to evolve without apology. By the time the later 1960s approached, the groundwork for transformation had quietly been laid. The industry may not have noticed the internal shift immediately, but Elvis felt it. He no longer viewed himself solely as a participant in a system. He began seeing himself as a decision-maker within it. That shift in mindset was crucial. Before public reinvention can occur, private conviction must solidify. The conversation in 1962 had not solved his career challenges. It had illuminated them. It had forced him to confront the uncomfortable truth that comfort had become a cage. Yet it had also reminded him that cages can be opened from the inside when courage replaces fear. As he stood on the edge of a new era, Elvis understood that reclaiming his artistry would require vulnerability on a scale he had not embraced in years. It would demand that he show audiences not just charm, but intensity, not just familiarity, but evolution. The risk was real, but so was the possibility. And for the first time in a long while, possibility felt stronger than fear. The moment before the fire returns. By the time 1967 began to draw to a close, the quiet internal shift inside Elvis Presley had matured into something more urgent. It was no longer a distant whisper questioning his direction. It had become a steady pressure, a demand for alignment between who he was privately and what the world was seeing publicly. The industry around him was changing rapidly. Music was becoming more experimental, more expressive, less restrained by formula. Cultural energy was intensifying. New artists were emerging with bold sounds and unapologetic authenticity. Elvis watched all of it with a mixture of admiration and reflection. He did not feel threatened by the rise of others. Instead, he felt challenged to remember who he had once been and to decide whether he still possessed the courage to be that version of himself again. The formula that had sustained his career through the early 1960s was beginning to show visible cracks. While the films continued to generate revenue, they no longer generated excitement. Even fans who adored him could sense repetition. The predictability that once felt safe now felt limiting. Elvis understood something that many around him preferred not to acknowledge. Safety and stagnation often look identical from the outside. It was not that he had lost talent. It was that talent had not been fully exercised, and unused potential carries a quiet ache. He thought often about that dinner years earlier with Marlon Brando. Brando's words had not been theatrical. They had been calm, almost simple, yet their simplicity gave them weight. "You're wasting your talent." At first, those words had landed like criticism. Over time, they transformed into motivation. They became less about judgment and more about responsibility. Elvis began to recognize that talent itself carries obligation. When someone possesses the ability to move people emotionally, to inspire them, to electrify them, there is a duty to honor that gift with seriousness. The pivotal moment did not arrive in a boardroom or through confrontation. It emerged gradually through exhaustion. Elvis realized he could no longer tolerate the feeling of artistic compromise. He had spent years navigating expectations, but the internal discomfort had grown stronger than the fear of change. He understood that reclaiming his authenticity would require more than adjusting small details. It would require stepping back into vulnerability publicly. That meant abandoning polished predictability in favor of raw presence. When discussions began around the possibility of a television special, it did not immediately feel historic. It felt uncertain. Television was not the glamorous frontier of reinvention at that time, yet there was something about the format that intrigued him. It offered intimacy. It offered immediacy. It offered the chance to strip away elaborate production and simply perform. Elvis sensed that within this opportunity lay something essential, a return not to nostalgia, but to truth. The early planning stages were filled with hesitation from many sides. There were debates about structure, tone, audience expectations. Some favored a traditional variety program. Others suggested maintaining the familiar, polished image. Elvis listened carefully, but for the first time in years, he felt a growing willingness to assert his instincts. He did not want to deliver something safe. He wanted something honest. That distinction mattered deeply. Rehearsals became a turning point. Surrounded by musicians rather than elaborate sets, Elvis rediscovered something he had missed profoundly: spontaneity. There is a difference between performing and expressing. During those sessions, expression began to replace performance. The energy was different. It was less controlled, more alive. He felt the electricity return, not the manufactured excitement of spectacle, but the authentic tension of creative risk. There were moments of doubt. Reinvention always carries uncertainty. Standing in rehearsal rooms, stripped of cinematic distraction, Elvis confronted the question he had quietly feared for years. Was the depth still there? Could he command attention without relying on formula? Every artist who attempts transformation faces that vulnerability. It is not about external critics. It is about internal belief. As rehearsals intensified, something extraordinary began to unfold. The confidence that had once seemed dulled by repetition reemerged with clarity. Elvis's voice carried both maturity and fire. His movements felt intentional rather than rehearsed. The connection between artist and music was visible again. It was not about reclaiming youth. It was about reclaiming authenticity. Privately, he reflected on Brando's challenge. He realized that what Brando had identified years earlier was not wasted talent in the literal sense. It was dormant courage. Talent without courage becomes comfortable. Talent with courage becomes transformative. Elvis was beginning to choose transformation. When the special finally took shape, it was not built around spectacle but around presence. The decision to perform in a stripped-down setting required confidence. It signaled trust in the material and in himself. There were no cinematic distractions to hide behind. There was only the artist and the audience. That simplicity was powerful precisely because it was vulnerable. The night of performance carried an energy unlike anything Elvis had experienced in years. There was anticipation, yes, but also resolve. This was not merely a televised appearance. It was a statement, to himself more than anyone else. Standing before the cameras, he was not thinking about market positioning or contracts. He was thinking about authenticity, about honoring the gift he had been given, about stepping back into risk rather than retreating into safety. As the music began, the shift was undeniable. The intensity returned. The connection returned. The raw magnetism that had first captivated audiences years earlier surged forward with renewed clarity. This was not nostalgia. It was evolution. The voice carried lived experience. The performance carried depth. The vulnerability that had once been suppressed by predictability now surfaced with conviction. When the special aired, the reaction was immediate and profound. Audiences did not simply see a familiar star. They witnessed resurgence. Critics who had grown complacent in their expectations were forced to reconsider. The narrative shifted. Elvis was not a relic of early fame. He was an artist who had chosen reinvention over comfort. In the days that followed, Elvis received calls and messages from peers who recognized what had occurred. Among them was Brando. There was no dramatic speech in that conversation. There did not need to be. Brando understood what it meant to reclaim artistic integrity. He recognized courage when he saw it. "You showed them," Brando reportedly said simply. But more importantly, Elvis had shown himself. The deeper victory was internal. The special did not erase past compromises, nor did it guarantee a future free of challenges. What it did was restore alignment between identity and expression. It proved that talent, when paired with courage, can reignite even after years of routine. For Elvis, the journey from that quiet restaurant booth in 1962 to the stage of reinvention had not been linear. It had required patience, reflection, and difficult honesty. Brando had planted a seed. Elvis had nurtured it privately, and when the moment arrived, he had chosen to step into the fire rather than remain in the shadows. Reinvention is rarely sudden. It is built through silent decisions long before public applause confirms it. By the end of that transformative period, Elvis understood something profound. The world may shape an artist's image, but only the artist can reclaim their truth. And once truth is reclaimed, it becomes impossible to ignore. What remains after the applause? Reinvention rarely ends with applause. Applause is a moment. Transformation is a process. After the triumphant return that reestablished Elvis Presley as a commanding live performer, the world saw confidence. It saw charisma. It saw energy that felt both familiar and renewed. What it did not see was the private understanding that had taken root inside him years earlier, the understanding that talent alone is never enough. Talent must be protected, challenged, and sometimes rescued from comfort. The resurgence that followed his return to the stage brought tour, recordings, and renewed cultural relevance. But more importantly, it brought something quieter and more personal: alignment. Elvis no longer felt like he was drifting inside someone else's plan. He felt involved in his direction again. That sense of ownership, even if imperfect, restored dignity. He was no longer merely sustaining a brand, he was expressing an identity. The friendship between Elvis and Marlon Brando did not unfold in constant public displays. Their lives were complicated, filled with professional commitments and personal challenges. Yet there remained a mutual respect forged not through flattery but through honesty. That night in 1962 had created something deeper than casual companionship. It had created accountability. Brando, for his part, observed Elvis's transformation with quiet satisfaction. He did not claim credit. He did not seek recognition for having spoken difficult words. But he understood the rare power of truth delivered with respect. In an industry often fueled by praise and pretense, he had chosen sincerity. And sincerity, when received by someone strong enough to face it, can alter the trajectory of a life. Elvis continued to face challenges in the years that followed. Success does not eliminate pressure, it magnifies it. Touring schedules became demanding, expectations intensified. The public wanted consistency while artistry requires evolution. Balancing those forces was never simple, yet the difference now was internal awareness. Elvis understood the cost of complacency. He had felt it. He had confronted it. And even when circumstances grew complicated, the memory of reclaiming his authenticity remained a compass. There were evenings during later tour when he would stand before thousands of fans and feel not just excitement but responsibility. He was no longer performing out of routine. He was performing out of purpose. He knew what it felt like to drift, and he knew what it felt like to fight for alignment. That knowledge shaped his presence. Audiences sensed it, even if they could not articulate it. Authenticity communicates without explanation. Meanwhile, Brando's own career followed a path defined by risk and depth. He, too, experienced public highs and private complexities, yet his belief in artistic seriousness never wavered. He valued courage above convenience, and in Elvis's resurgence, he saw confirmation that courage can be contagious. One honest conversation can awaken dormant strength. Years later, when reflecting privately on their friendship, Brando would speak not of stardom but of humanity. He would recall the vulnerability he witnessed that November evening, the quiet admission of fear, of loneliness, of uncertainty. That vulnerability had been more powerful than any performance. It revealed a man aware of his potential yet uncertain how to access it. And it proved something fundamental. Even the most celebrated figures carry private battles invisible to the public eye. The legacy of that dinner was not merely artistic revival. It was proof that identity is not fixed. A person can feel trapped inside success and still choose transformation. The world often assumes that those at the top have complete control. The truth is more complex. Fame can create structures as confining as failure. Breaking free requires internal conviction before external change. As time moved forward, Elvis's life continued to unfold in ways both triumphant and difficult. Public adoration remained strong. Cultural influence endured. Yet beneath all of it was a lesson he had learned deeply. That safety without growth leads to quiet regret, while risk, even imperfect risk, leads to vitality. He had tasted both. And once someone experiences the fire of authentic expression again, routine becomes harder to tolerate. The world often simplifies stories. It reduces complex lives into headlines or myths. But the true story of that November evening was not about criticism. It was about belief. Brando believed Elvis capable of depth. Elvis chose to believe it too. That mutual recognition shifted possibility into action. There is something profoundly human about that exchange. It reminds us that transformation rarely begins with applause or public encouragement. It begins with someone willing to look beyond the surface and say, gently but firmly, "You are capable of more." Those words can sting. They can unsettle, but they can also liberate. For Elvis, the liberation was not instantaneous. It required years of internal negotiation. It required confronting fear of failure and dismantling comfort built over time. Yet when the moment came to step back into risk, he did so not recklessly but intentionally. That intention mattered. It turned performance into declaration. In the end, what remains after the applause fades is not chart positions or ticket sales. What remains is alignment, the knowledge that one chose courage over complacency at least once when it mattered most. Elvis carried that knowledge with him, and Brando carried the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had spoken truth at the right time. Their story offers a larger reflection on resilience. Success can dull urgency if left unexamined. Comfort can disguise stagnation, but talent paired with honest friendship has the power to reignite direction. The human spirit, when challenged respectfully, often rises. On that cool November night in 1962, two men sat in a quiet corner of Los Angeles and spoke words that would ripple forward through years of creative struggle and eventual resurgence. The world did not witness that conversation. It did not applaud it, but its impact was undeniable. Because sometimes the most important turning points happen not under stage lights, but in the stillness of honest dialogue, where pride steps aside, vulnerability speaks, and courage begins to grow. And long after the final curtain falls, that courage becomes the truest measure of legacy. End of story.